If I was stood on this very footpath 2,325 years ago and I'd waited around for 5 or 10 minutes, a man would walk past me heading in that direction on this very footpath, and he was doing something truly staggering. Imagine setting sail from your home into the unmapped ocean, not knowing what was over the horizon. No GPS, no Google Earth, nothing really to guide you on your quest. Just a wooden ship creaking in the waves. Your only other knowledge is that of the stars as a compass and tales of other lands which you're not even sure exist. Now imagine doing that well over 2,000 years ago, a time when the Iron Age people ruled this land. And with that in mind, come and have a look at what lays just up ahead. Imagine that after travelling for over 1,000 miles, you end up walking on the very path that I'm walking on right now, the first human that we know of to write about this island of Britannia. For that person to then return home from lands so far away, your stories sounded like you just made them up. In fact, no one believed him. His discoveries were mocked and his tales were lost and buried for centuries to come. He wrote about what he saw, the science of the places he went. He wrote about the never-setting sun of the north and the huge tidal ranges. And whilst he was never taken seriously at the time, everything he wrote would turn out to be true. This isn't Columbus or Marco Polo. This isn't Eric the Red. This is Pytheas, an explorer you may not have heard of, but one whose journey pushed the boundaries of the known world that we're still learning about today. Whilst ancient Greece was busy doing ancient Greek things, Pytheas quietly slipped out of a port in Marseille and became the first person in recorded history to describe Britain, the Arctic Circle, and maybe even glimpse Iceland centuries before the Vikings. This is the story of one man's journey, a hugely important journey, and why I feel like this man, Pytheas, is the greatest explorer of all time that you may not have heard of. Our story starts in the city which we now know as Marseille, a city founded on commerce and trade, accounting for the wealth of the local area. The region itself produced wines, food, herbs, which attracted craftspeople from far and wide, goldsmiths, amber jewellery makers, workers of copper and bronze. The arrival of merchants north of the Gaul bringing all sorts of treasures, gold, tin, amber. Perhaps they were the reason that sparked Pytheas' initial curiosity. The Stoic view of the spherical Earth would have been one that Pytheas would have been aware of. They believed the Earth was split into 4 horizontal zones. But the question may well have hung over him, those traders perhaps not willing to talk about the places that they had been and where their goods came from. They must have been coming from somewhere. Somebody must have been extracting these goods in the north from this supposedly uninhabitable zone. This probably didn't add up to Pytheas. We don't know Pytheas' exact age, but it's believed he was born in around 350 BCE. He was a geographer and an astronomer, so would have been well aware of how to measure base points of latitude. So why exactly did Pytheas leave? Okay, we know there were treasures from the north coming from somewhere, but was that enough to draw him away from the comfort of his own city? There was an incessant need for bronze in this era. Now, in the Mediterranean, where Pytheas would live, well, to get bronze, you needed to alloy tin with copper, like anywhere else. But the biggest problem we have here in the Med is a distinct lack of tin. The traders of the time would of course offer very limited or no information on whatsoever on where their goods came from, and why ever would they? You're almost inventing competition by doing so. Pytheas left Marseille on the start of his voyage. We know very little about this part of the journey. However, what we do know is it's highly likely this was problematic. Well, to leave the Mediterranean by the Straits of Gibraltar, Pytheas would have encountered his first problem. The Carthaginians had closed off the Straits of Gibraltar to all ships of other nations. It's possible that the first part of this journey was done over land. That said, it's at this very point we realise now the capacity in which people didn't believe in Pytheas and the journey that he had made. Now, Eratosthenes made a number of statements about the first part of this journey of Pytheas. Now, Strabo tells us that well, we should completely ignore these because those statements were made from Pytheas. But if we do believe Eratosthenes, and there's no reason why we shouldn't, then that first part of the journey from Pytheas was indeed made via the Straits of Gibraltar.
Perhaps Marseille had its own trade treaty with the Carthaginians of northern Africa, and perhaps it in itself gives us the first clue of how he made this entire trip. Now, one thing we know for sure about this journey, this adventure, is that Pytheas didn't write down the means by which he travelled, and we don't mean did he travel by land or by sea, we mean specifically the type of vessel that he travelled on. In more recent times, a collective agreement is that Pytheas did not sail on his own boat, but instead travelled as a passenger from port to port. Okay, so this helps us explain a lot. Not least he isn't just sort of winging this journey alone, but also...
Well, this in itself helps us to understand perhaps the biggest question of all. Where exactly in Britain did Pytheas land? Now, I'm walking the Harrow Way today. It's all become clear as to why very soon if it hasn't already. And I really want to show you that a number of places this whole trackway has got significant sort of holloway bits from it, but not just one. Like up here we've got another one there, another one over there, so 1, 2, 3, and another one right back over here. 4. That's the main trackway at the moment, but there's at least 4. It's like some kind of motorway system here. This is probably one of the oldest tracks in Britain, and it's got 3, 4, maybe 5 separate holloways on various different parts, at least that I've explored. Fascinating.
The biggest issue with this entire tale is that Pytheas' writing on this, his journal and the book he made thereafter on the ocean, well, it's lost to time. It's completely gone, discarded perhaps, or perhaps burnt in the Great Fire of Alexandria. And so what we're left with today is fragments of information from those that wrote about his writings, and of course a whole bunch of comments and assumptions thereafter.
Outside of those, well, we do have other fragments and assumptions. In fact, 39 fragments were quoted in a recent work by Scott 2022. Astronomers, geographers, historians of all ilks, who I will avoid pronouncing.
Now those clues just give us a few puzzle pieces. We have a giant puzzle to try and put together. The fun starts for us though is when we try and put those together in some kind of semblance. Most have taken the view that Pytheas sailed from what is now Brittany directly towards Cornwall. If we think that Pytheas were in pursuit of tin, then that trip direct to Cornwall would make good sense. However, nowhere on any surviving fragment of text do we have direct quotation that Pytheas did indeed disembark on this part of Britain. At this point, it's just speculation. Some have interpreted Pytheas as talking of a port in Kent, the peninsula. This can be disputed, however.
But not only that, it has been suggested that we have 2 other indicators that this is where Pytheas first landed.
Firstly, Strabo suggests Pytheas talks of the 4 promontories of Britain and even agrees that he must have known about them. So did he land in the east first in Kent? Adds up. Secondly, over a month after Pytheas landed in Britain, well, he's said to leave from Cornwall down there in the southwest corner and head north for the Scottish Islands.
So in other words, he didn't travel east along the English Channel after that. So then we can ask this huge question: how did he write so much of the people of Kent if he didn't then go there afterwards? This implies very much that he went there first.
Okay, so here is where we need to be a little bit careful about our speculation. The main proponent for this theory that Pytheas landed in Dover is someone who believes very strongly that Pytheas then travelled by land to Cornwall, visiting Stonehenge on his route, instead of travelling via sea along the south coast.
If we assume that Pytheas didn't go from Brittany straight up to Cornwall, and instead he went along the English Channel, perhaps because of the unwillingness of someone to take him or lack of trade ships or whatever, well, this would add up. Perhaps not the visiting Stonehenge bit.
However, the fragment of information we have here that supports the Stonehenge theory comes via Diodorus, and it does not explicitly name Pytheas as the source, and may well be paraphrasing other writers that drew from Pytheas.
Well, Pytheas does indeed refer to a circular temple of Apollo, and while that does sound really compelling, and it could well be Stonehenge, it could also be hundreds of other monuments that we know and love. Either way, what we learn next is Pytheas Pytheas did indeed travel on land, and he wrote about the people, the Britanni or Britannia of Britannia.
Britannia is inhabited by tribes which are indigenous and preserve their ways of living, the ancient ways of life. For instance, they use chariots in their walls, their dwellings are humble, they are simple and far removed from the shrewdness and vice that characterised the man of our day. The island is thickly populated, well clear of luxury of wealth, and its climate is extremely cold as it lies under the Great Bear. It is held by many kings who for the most of the part live in peace amongst themselves. I love reading this. This is the prehistoric record, a written record of Britain and what the people were doing here on this island 2,500 years ago, how they lived, how they traded, how they farmed, how they fought, how they battled, their way of life. We don't have any writing like this from our own shores, but we do have these fragments of information from Pytheas, who made the journey here 2,300 years ago.
Pytheas tells us that the Iron Age people of Britain, specifically those of Cornwall, well, they mined tin ore and they smelted it into sort of knuckle bone shaped ingots.
They then transported these to the Isle of Ictus. We don't know where that is specifically. However, an extremely strong contender is St Michael's Mount. Diodorus goes on to suggest that the inhabitants of Cornwall were extremely well-mannered, probably due to their trade with these foreign merchants. They really knew how to trade well and get the best of what they had. St Michael's Mount is tidal, and this alone is one area that helps give us credence to the words of Pytheas despite his doubters.
Pytheas talks of tides that rise for 6 hours and then lower for 6 hours, and they're at their greatest when the moon is above, and this is very much one reason that Strabo gave that Pytheas was almost certainly lying about his journey.
Pytheas had done with Cornwall, but what exactly was next for him and why? Pytheas saw Britain as a triangle, like perhaps many others before him, and from this peninsula of Cornwall we now head north to Anglesey, on to the Isle of Man, and then on further north. Pytheas claimed to have travelled the whole of Britain that was accessible. Now what exactly he means by that, well, we're not completely sure, but he did give us an estimate of Britain's size, a perimeter of more than 40,000 stadia. Now depending on which definition of a stadia you use, that can mean anywhere between 4,500 to nearly 5,000 miles in circumference. For comparison, modern measurements of Britain with all of its ins and outs, well, that's around 7,700 miles, give or take, so Pytheas wasn't a million miles out.
So whether he did indeed travel and circumnavigate the island of Britain by ship, or whether he walked a lot of it, or whether he combined the two, well, his estimations certainly gave us the notion that he did indeed explore it, even if later writers couldn't exactly agree on the mathematics used to get to those estimations.
After circling Britain, Pytheas claimed to have pushed even farther north to a mysterious place he called Fewley. He describes it as 6 days' sail beyond Britain and the very edge of the known world. No one is quite sure what Fewley is. Was it Norway, was it Iceland, or perhaps even one of the remote Scottish islands? What makes his account striking are the details. He spoke of a strange land where the sun barely set in the summer and seas choked with a mixture of ice, slush and water. An early description of the Arctic.
These observations, especially that of the near never setting sun, really did tell us that Pytheas did venture this far north. Whether it was Iceland or not, well, maybe we will never know.
On his return journey, Pytheas did not simply sail home. Instead he travelled towards the Jutland Peninsula. The reason seems clear. Amber. The ancient world prized amber for jewellery, decoration and even medicine, and Northern Europe was one of the chief sources. By tracing the trade routes of amber, Pytheas wasn't just exploring, he was connecting the distant edges of Europe with the bustling Mediterranean markets back home. His voyage north of Britain and then into the Baltic Sea made him one of the very first explorers to describe this region, centuries before anyone else. And maybe that's why Pytheas matters, not because the world world believed him, because it didn't, not because he was celebrated, because he was largely forgotten, but because he went anyway. He left no empire, no monuments, no treasure, only fragments, scattered words, half-remembered lines, and a handful of observations carried forward. And yet from those fragments we glimpse a mind that refused to stay at home and refused to accept what was. A man who walked across Britain, who traced its coast to coast, who ventured towards the Arctic until the sea itself turned to ice. In the end, Pytheas returned to a world that wasn't ready for him and his story. They dismissed him, they mocked him, and they buried his work. Every map of the north, every description of the midnight sun, every sailor who charts the tide or an icy coast echoes the journey taken long before any of them were born.
Well, for me, Pytheas didn't just explore the world, he expanded it. Now, I hope you enjoyed today's slightly different adventure. Kind of tends to happen this time of year when it gets a little bit cold. We have a significant Patreon behind the scenes community where we share behind the scenes videos, and we have a Discord server, and we can all sort of chat and talk about the topics that we've been talking about. So I'd love for you to sign up for that. We've got the link in the description below. I'll see you this time next week.